The Galactic Academy of Martial Arts floated in the darkness of space like a small moon made of metal and glass. It orbited a dead world called Prime, far from any planet where wars might reach it. Here, the children of powerful families came to learn how to fight, how to lead, and how to survive. They came from 100 different worlds, speaking 100 different languages, but inside the academy they all learned together. Stood at the window of her small room and looked out at the stars. She was 17 years old, small and thin, with black hair that she kept tied back in a simple knot. Her hands were rough with old scars, and her eyes held a kind of quiet watchfulness that made other students uncomfortable. She was the only human in the entire academy, the only person from Earth. Earth was classified as a Class 7 in the galactic records. This meant it was considered one of the most dangerous planets in the known universe. The gravity was too strong. The weather was too violent. The animals were too deadly. The bacteria and viruses could kill most alien species within hours. When the galactic community first discovered humans, they could not believe that intelligent life had evolved on such a hostile world. And yet here was. She had not come to the academy through wealth or family connections. She had no family. When she was 7 years old, her colony ship had suffered a catastrophic failure. Everyone else had died, had survived alone in the drifting wreckage for 3 years, eating emergency rations, recycling her own water, learning to fix broken machines with nothing but her small hands and desperate determination. A patrol ship had found her when she was 10. They had called her a miracle. They had called her impossible. They had sent her to the academy because they did not know what else to do with a human child who had already seen more death than most soldiers. Now, 7 years later, she was about to face the most important test of her education. The morning bell rang through the station, a soft chime that meant all students should gather in the main hall, put on her simple gray uniform and walk through the curved corridors of the academy. Other students passed her, most of them much larger than her. A group of meridians towered above her, their 4 arms folded against their scaled chests. A noble glided past on legs that bent backward like a bird's, his blue skin glowing softly in the artificial light. None of them spoke to her, they rarely did. The main hall was a vast circular chamber with a domed ceiling that showed the stars outside. At the center stood Instructor, a meridian of great age and reputation. His scales were copper-colored, dulled slightly by his centuries of life, and his 4 yellow eyes missed nothing that happened in his classroom. "Today," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall, "you will face your crucible examination." A murmur ran through the assembled students. The crucible was legendary. It was the test that separated true warriors from pretenders. Many students had failed it over the centuries. Some had never recovered from the shame. "You will forge a blade," Instructor continued. "A weapon worthy of your lineage and your training. You have 6 hours. The forge chamber has been prepared with the finest materials in the galaxy." He gestured toward a massive door at the far end of the hall. It slid open, revealing the forge chamber beyond. Could see the glow of plasma furnaces, the gleam of polished metal ingots, the organized rows of tools and workstations. "You may use any material provided," Instructor said. "You may use any technique you have learned. At the end of 6 hours, you will present your blade for judgment. Begin." The students rushed forward, watched them go, her face calm, her mind already working. A prince with luminescent skin and an attitude of permanent superiority was the first to reach the materials. He grabbed a large ingot of steel, the most valuable metal in the chamber. It was famous across the galaxy for holding an edge sharper than any other substance. "Out of my way," he said as he passed. "This examination requires actual skill, not whatever primitive survival tricks they teach on your planet." Said nothing. She had learned long ago that words were wasted on people like. A young Meridian and the nephew of Instructor claimed a block of crystallized titanium. His 4 hands were already working, already planning, already confident in his inevitable success. He was the best smith in their year. Everyone knew it. His blade would be magnificent. Even a girl with wings like delicate glass had found her material. She carried a bar of alloy, lighter than air but stronger than most metals. She glanced at as she passed and offered a small, sympathetic smile. Was one of the few students who had ever shown any kindness. Waited until the rush had ended. She walked slowly into the forge chamber, past the workstations where her classmates were already heating their metals, past the racks of gleaming ingots, past the plasma furnaces that burned hot enough to melt almost anything. She walked all the way to the back of the chamber, where the waste bin stood in a neglected corner. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. "Looking for scraps, probably," laughed. "They can't afford real materials." Ignored them. She had found what she was looking for. It was a bone, a massive femur from a beast, a creature from another called IV. The bone had been used in anatomy classes the previous semester, and someone had thrown it away afterward. It was yellowed with age, cracked in a few places, covered in a thin layer of dust. To anyone else, it was garbage. It was perfect. She carried the bone to an empty workstation at the far end of the chamber. The other students stopped their work to stare at her. Even instructor raised one of his 4 eyebrows in surprise. "Bone," said in disbelief. "She's going to forge a blade from bone." "Impossible," declared. "Bone cannot hold an edge, it's porous and brittle. Every child knows this." "Maybe she's given up," another student suggested. "Maybe she knows she can't compete with us." But was not listening to them. She was looking at the bone in her hands, feeling its weight, studying its structure. She knew things about bone that these students had never needed to learn. She knew that bone was not weak. Bone was strong in ways that metal could never be. On Earth, her ancestors had survived ice ages with nothing but bone tools. They had hunted mammoths and bears and creatures that would terrify any alien species. They had built civilizations from stone and bone and sheer determination, long before they ever discovered metal. Set the bone on her workstation and began to work. She started by cleaning it, scraping away the remaining tissue with a small knife. She worked carefully, methodically, the way she had learned to work during those 3 years alone on the drifting ship. Patience was a skill she had mastered long ago. When you had nothing else, patience could keep you alive. The other students returned to their own work, dismissing her as a curiosity, a failure in progress. Let them think what they wanted, knew something they did not. She knew what it meant to come from a. She knew what it meant to survive when everything around you wanted you dead. She knew that the universe did not care about noble bloodlines or expensive materials or centuries of tradition. The universe only cared about one thing, results, and intended to deliver results that none of them would ever forget. The forge chamber was filled with the sounds of work. Hammers rang against metal. Plasma furnaces roared with intense heat. Students called out to each other, asking for tools, comparing progress, boasting about their designs. It was a symphony of creation, and at its center, 32 young warriors were forging their futures. Worked in silence at her station in the corner. She had placed the bone in a low-temperature furnace, but not to melt it. Bone could not be melted like metal. Instead, she was drying it slowly, driving out every tiny bit of moisture that remained in its structure. Wet bone was weak bone. Dry bone was something else entirely. While the bone heated, she returned to the waste bins. The other students paid no attention to her. They were too focused on their own magnificent creations to notice the human girl picking through garbage. Found exactly what she needed. There were strips of sinew left over from old leather projects, dried and discarded. There was tree resin from botanical samples, hardened into amber-colored lumps. There were even shed scales from a Meridian student, swept into the corner and forgotten. She gathered everything and carried it back to her workstation. Each item was worthless on its own. Together, they would become something remarkable. The girl with glass-like wings had set up her workstation nearby. She was struggling with her alloy, her delicate hands not quite strong enough to shape the stubborn metal. But she kept glancing at, curiosity growing on her gentle face. "What are you making?" finally asked. Looked up from her work. Most students would have mocked her by now, but's question seemed genuine. "A blade," said simply. "From bone." "Yes." Tilted her head, her wings catching the light from the furnaces. "I have never seen anyone forge with bone before. Is this a human technique?" "Very old human technique," said. "Before my people had metal, we had bone. We survived for 1,000,000 years using tools like this." 1,000,000 years. Eyes widened. On her world, they had discovered metal within a few thousand years of developing intelligence. The idea of surviving for so long without it was almost impossible to imagine. "Earth is not a kind planet," said. She checked the furnace, saw that the bone was ready, and carefully removed it with thick gloves. The bone was now completely dry, lighter than before and slightly darker in color. Perfect. She began to carve. On the other side of the chamber was making excellent progress on his steel sword. The metal glowed orange-white in his plasma furnace, and he shaped it with tools designed specifically for hands. His movements were graceful, almost dancing, as he folded and hammered and folded again. "Look at that edge," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "This blade will cut through starship armor. This blade will be remembered for generations." Was equally impressive at his station. His 4 arms worked in perfect coordination, each one handling a different tool. His crystallized titanium blade was taking shape as a traditional meridian weapon, with 4 edges instead of 2, designed for the complex fighting style of his people. Instructor walked among the students, observing their work, offering occasional comments. When he reached the station, he stopped and watched for a long moment. She was carving the bone with hand tools, not plasma cutters. Her movements were slow and careful, removing tiny amounts of material with each stroke. The blade was beginning to take shape now, curved like a crescent moon, thin and elegant. "You are not using heat to shape it," instructor observed. "Heat would damage the structure," explained without stopping her work. "Bone is made of tiny fibers like rope. If I heat it too much, the fibers break apart. The blade becomes weak." "You know much about bone." "I had time to learn." Instructor understood what she meant. 3 years alone on a drifting ship. 3 years with nothing to do but study the emergency databases, read old technical manuals, and find ways to stay alive. Most children would have gone mad. This one had learned. He moved on without another word, but noticed that his expression had changed slightly. He was no longer looking at her with curiosity. He was looking at her with respect. The hours passed, continued her slow, careful work. She carved the bone into a blade about 30 centimeters long, curved and single-edged in the style of old earth hunting knives. The edge she ground thin against a whetstone she had made herself from compressed ash. It took a long time, but when she finished, the edge was sharp enough to cut paper without tearing it. Then came the handle. She wrapped it in layer after layer of the dried sinew, soaking each layer in water first so it would shrink as it dried. This created a grip that was both strong and comfortable, molded perfectly to her small human hands. The sinew would absorb shock during impact, protecting her wrist and arm from injury. The resin she heated over a small flame until it became liquid again. She applied it to the blade in thin coats, each one adding a layer of protection and strength. The resin filled the tiny pores in the bone, making it waterproof and resistant to cracking. Finally, she took the meridian scales she had collected and ground them into a fine powder. She mixed this powder into her final coat of resin and applied it to the entire blade. The result was beautiful in its own strange way. The blade shimmered with a subtle light, the the ground scales catching the glow of the furnaces. It looked nothing like the gleaming metal swords her classmates were creating. It looked primitive, almost savage, but there was a purpose to every part of its design. "Time remaining, 1 hour," announced a mechanical voice through the chamber. The students increased their pace. Final sharpening, final polishing, final adjustments. The air was thick with tension and the smell of hot metal. Was already finished. She sat at her workstation, holding her bone blade, testing its balance and weight. She had done everything she could. Now she could only wait. Finished her rapier shortly after, her delicate hands trembling with exhaustion. She looked at its blade and said nothing, but her expression was thoughtful. Completed his steel sword with a flourish, holding it up to catch the light. The blade was indeed magnificent, a masterpiece of galactic metallurgy. It would have been worth a fortune on any civilized world. His four-edged blade was equally impressive, a perfect example of meridian craftsmanship. He presented it to his uncle with obvious pride. An instructor gave a small nod of approval. When the 6 hours ended, the mechanical voice announced that all work must stop. Students stepped back from their stations, some satisfied, some nervous, some already calculating their likely scores. "Now," instructor said, his copper scales gleaming in the furnace light, "you will present your blades for judgment. We will test their sharpness, their strength, and their practicality. Those who pass will advance to the final year of training. Those who fail will be given one more chance next semester." He paused, his 4 yellow eyes sweeping across the assembled students. "Who wishes to present first?" Stepped forward immediately, his luminescent skin bright with confidence. "I will demonstrate the superiority of steel," he announced. "Watch and learn, classmates. This is how a true warrior forges a weapon." He walked toward the testing station, his magnificent sword gleaming in his hand. Watched him go and felt nothing, not nervousness, not fear, not doubt. She had spent 6 months preparing for this examination. She had studied every material in the Academy's database. She had learned their properties, their weaknesses, their histories. She had chosen bone not because she was poor or desperate, but because bone was the right choice for what she planned to demonstrate. The other students thought they were forging weapons for a test. Was forging a lesson they would never forget. The testing station stood at the center of the forge chamber, surrounded by a circle of eager students. It was a simple platform with various materials arranged for blade evaluation. Blocks of synthetic flesh, plates of hardened ceramic, coils of thick rope, and other items designed to test every quality a weapon might need. Stepped onto the platform with his steel sword held high. The blade caught the light beautifully, its edge so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself. He was smiling, confident, absolutely certain of his victory. "The first test," instructor announced, "is sharpness. Cut the synthetic flesh." Swung his sword in a single elegant motion. The blade passed through the synthetic flesh like it was made of water, leaving a clean cut that would have been instantly fatal to any living creature. The students murmured in appreciation. "Excellent edge," instructor noted. "The second test is durability. Strike the ceramic plate." Adjusted his grip and brought his sword down on the hardened ceramic. The plate cracked and fell apart, but the blade remained perfect, not a single chip or scratch on its gleaming surface. Steel was famous for its durability, and its blade proved worthy of its reputation. The tests continued, cutting rope, blocking simulated attacks, measuring balance and weight. Passed every test with high marks, and when he finally stepped down from the platform, his smile had grown even wider. "Good luck matching that," he said as he passed. One by one, the other students presented their blades. His four-edged sword performed beautifully, though its specialized design made it less effective at some tests. His rapier was light and fast, but lacked the power of heavier blades. Each student had strengths and weaknesses, but all of them had produced respectable weapons. Then it was turn. She walked to the platform carrying her bone blade. The other students parted to let her through, and she could hear their whispers. This should be amusing. How long before it breaks? I almost feel sorry for her, almost. Stepped onto the platform and faced instructor. His 4 yellow eyes studied her blade with careful attention, revealing nothing of his thoughts. Explain your creation, he said. Held up the bone blade. This is a knife in the tradition of the Inuit people of Earth. They were hunters who lived in the coldest part of my planet, where temperatures could reach -50 degrees and blizzards could last for weeks. They had no metal. They had no advanced technology. They had only bone, stone, and their own determination to survive. And you believe such a primitive design can compete with steel, called out from the crowd. I believe it can do things steel cannot, said calmly. Instructor gestured to the testing materials. Show us. Approached the first test, the synthetic flesh. She did not swing her blade with the dramatic flair that had shown. Instead, she made a simple, practical cutting motion, the kind a hunter would use to skin an animal. The blade cut cleanly through the flesh, and the wound it left was different from S's cut. Where his straight blade had made a narrow slice, S's curved blade had made a wide, gaping wound that would have caused massive bleeding in a real creature. The curve is designed for cutting, not stabbing, explained. It pulls across the target, maximizing damage with minimum force. Some students nodded thoughtfully, others still looked skeptical. The second test was the ceramic plate. Did not try to cut through it as had done. Instead, she struck it at an angle with the flat of her blade. The ceramic shattered into a dozen pieces, but the bone remained completely intact. Bone is flexible, she said. It bends instead of breaking. Metal absorbs impact and transfers it back to the blade, causing chips and cracks over time. Bone absorbs impact and dissipates it through its structure. Instructor leaned forward slightly. Interesting, continue. Passed the remaining standard tests. Her blade cut rope efficiently, blocked simulated attacks without damage, and demonstrated excellent balance for its size and weight. Her scores were not the highest, but they were respectable. Then she did something no one expected. I request one additional test, she said. The chamber fell silent. Students exchanged confused glances. Additional tests were not part of the standard examination. Explain, instructor said. Pointed to the environmental simulation chamber at the far end of the forge room. It was a sealed room with transparent walls, capable of recreating the conditions of any planet in the galactic database. Students sometimes used it for training exercises, experiencing combat in different gravities and atmospheres. I request a demonstration in the simulation chamber, said. Set it to the conditions of Meridian Prime, combat standard temperature. Stepped forward, his forearms crossed. Why Meridian Prime? Because Meridian Prime is cold, said. -60 degrees standard, cold enough to affect metal. A murmur ran through the crowd. His confident smile flickered for just a moment. Instructor considered the request. It was unusual but not against the rules, and he was curious, genuinely curious to see what this human girl had planned. Granted, he said, prepare the simulation chamber. A technician hurried to the controls. The chamber hummed to life, and through its transparent walls the students could see frost forming on the inner surfaces. The temperature display on the wall began to drop, -10 degrees, -20, -30. Turn 2. I will need to borrow your sword for this demonstration. What? His blue skin flickered with anger. Absolutely not. I will not let you damage my blade with your foolish experiment. Are you afraid? Asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Every student was watching now, waiting to see how the proud prince would respond. His luminescent skin brightened with fury. I fear nothing, especially not you. He thrust his sword toward her. Take it. Show everyone what happens when primitive savages try to match civilized craftsmanship. Took the steel sword in one hand and her bone blade in the other. The temperature in the simulation chamber had reached -60 degrees. Frost covered every surface inside, and the air itself seemed to crystallize. She walked to the chamber door and stepped inside. The cold hit her immediately, a brutal assault that would have killed most alien species within minutes, but was human. Her ancestors had survived ice ages. Her body knew how to handle cold, how to redirect blood flow to vital organs, how to generate heat through shivering. She had perhaps 5 minutes before hypothermia became dangerous. 5 minutes was more than enough. She held up both blades so the students could see them clearly through the transparent walls. The steel was already changing, its bright gleam fading as frost formed on its surface. Metal contracted in cold, its molecules pulling closer together, becoming more rigid. Swung the steel sword once, twice. On the third swing, she struck it against the frozen wall of the chamber. The steel shattered. It broke into 3 pieces, the blade falling from the handle, the tip flying off in another direction. The finest metal in the galaxy, worth more than most students would earn in a year, had been destroyed by simple cold. The students outside gasped. His luminescent skin went dark with shock. But was not finished. She held up her bone blade and swung it in wide arcs, demonstrating its flexibility, its strength, its absolute integrity. The blade bent slightly with each swing, absorbing the stress, adapting to the cold just as it had been designed to do by millions of years of evolution. She struck the wall with the bone blade. It did not break. She struck it again harder. Still it held. She continued swinging, cutting, blocking, demonstrating everything a warrior might need to do in combat, and the bone blade performed flawlessly. Walked out of the simulation chamber, her breath fogging in the warm air of the forge room, her bone blade still perfect in her hand. She dropped the broken pieces of sword at his feet. "Steel," she said, "is the finest metal in the galaxy. It holds the sharpest edge. It wins every test in controlled conditions, but the universe is not a controlled condition." She looked around at her classmates, at their shocked faces and wide eyes. "I chose bone because bone survives. Bone adapts. Bone does not fail when conditions become difficult. That is what it means to come from a—" The forge chamber was completely silent. Then instructor began to applaud. The applause of instructor echoed through the silent forge chamber. It was a strange sound, coming from a being with 4 hands, but there was no mistaking its meaning. The ancient Meridian warrior was impressed. Slowly, hesitantly, other students began to join in. Clapped her delicate hands together, her wings fluttering with excitement. A few Meridian students added their four-armed applause. Even some of the nobles who had mocked earlier were now looking at her with something other than contempt. Stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces of his magnificent sword. His luminescent skin had gone completely dark, a sign of deep emotional distress among the people. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "The examination is concluded," instructor announced. "Results will be posted tomorrow. You are all dismissed." The students began to file out of the forge chamber, talking among themselves in hushed voices. The day's events had given them much to discuss. A human girl had humiliated the proud prince. A weapon of bone had outperformed the finest metal in the galaxy. Everything they thought they knew about forging had been turned upside down. Remained at the testing platform, carefully cleaning her bone blade with a soft cloth. She had not expected applause. She had not expected anything except the satisfaction of proving her point. Now that it was over, she felt strangely empty. Approached her cautiously like someone approaching a wild animal that might bite. "That was incredible," she said. "I have never seen anything like it." Looked up from her work. It was just physics. Metal becomes brittle in extreme cold. Bone does not. Anyone could have figured it out. But no one did, said. No one except you. How did you know about the cold? How did you know steel would break? I studied, said simply. I read the Academy's database. I learned about every material, every condition, every possible variable. I spent 6 months preparing for this examination. 6 months, eyes widened. I spent perhaps 2 weeks. And that is the difference between your world and mine. Tucked her blade into her belt. On you have time, you have safety. You have the luxury of assuming things will work out. On Earth, we never assume anything. We prepare for the worst because the worst happens often. Was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. Is Earth really so terrible? Earth is beautiful, said, and there was a softness in her voice that had never heard before. It has mountains that touch the sky and oceans that cover half the world. It has forests so thick you can walk for days without seeing the sun. It has deserts of sand and ice and stone, each one different, each one deadly in its own way. She paused, looking at something only she could see. But yes, it is also terrible. Everything on Earth is trying to kill everything else. The animals hunt each other. The plants poison each other. Even the weather can kill you if you are not careful. We evolved in a world where death was always one mistake away. That sounds horrible, whispered. It sounds like home, said. Across the chamber, finally moved. He picked up the pieces of his broken sword and stared at them with an expression of pure disbelief. He had owned that blade for only 6 hours, but in those hours he had imagined a glorious future. He had imagined duels won and enemies defeated, and songs sung about his legendary weapon. Now it was garbage. He looked up at, and his dark eyes burned with humiliation and rage. You did this on purpose, he said. You planned this from the beginning. You wanted to destroy me. Met his gaze without flinching. I planned to demonstrate the limitations of metal in extreme conditions. Your destruction was a side effect. A side effect, his voice rose. You called me out in front of everyone. You made me look like a fool. You made yourself look like a fool, said calmly. You mocked me from the moment I entered this academy. You called me primitive. You called me savage. You assumed that because I come from I must be inferior to you in every way. She stepped closer to him, and despite her small size, there was something in her presence that made the taller take a step back. Let me tell you something about, we do not produce weakness. We cannot afford weakness. Every human who has ever lived was shaped by 10,000 generations of ancestors who refused to die. We survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars. We climbed out of caves and learned to dominate our entire planet, not because we were the strongest or the fastest but because we never, ever gave up. Said nothing. His luminescent skin flickered uncertainly. Your sword was beautiful, continued. It was a masterpiece of civilized craftsmanship, but it was built for a civilized universe, a universe where everything works according to plan, where conditions are controlled, where enemies fight fair. That universe does not exist. She held up her bone blade, this simple weapon that had embarrassed the finest metal in the galaxy. This blade is ugly, it is primitive. It would not win any prizes for beauty or elegance, but it works. It works in the cold and the heat and the rain and the dust. It works when everything else fails. That is what humans build. That is what teach. The forge chamber had gone quiet again. Students who had been leaving stopped to listen. Instructor stood in the doorway, watching with his 4 ancient eyes. Looked at the broken sword in his hands, then at its bone blade, then at the human girl who had shattered everything he believed about the universe. How, he finally asked, and his voice was small, almost childlike. How do you think like this? How do you see things that the rest of us miss? Considered the question carefully. It was the first honest thing had ever said to her. Fear, she said. Humans are afraid of everything. We are afraid of the dark and the cold and the unknown. We are afraid of pain and death and failure. But instead of letting fear control us, we use it. We let it drive us to prepare, to plan, to think about what might go wrong. She touched the handle of her bone blade, feeling the sinew wrapping she had made with her own hands. Every time I look at something, I ask myself, what happens if this fails? What happens if conditions change? What is my backup plan, my escape route, my last resort? I learned to think this way because on Earth, optimists die young. Made a small sound of surprise. That seems like a very stressful way to live. It is, admitted. Humans have more anxiety disorders than any other known species. We worry constantly about things that may never happen, but that same worry is why we survived when other species did not. It is our curse and our gift. Instructor finally stepped forward. The ancient Meridian had watched humans for centuries, had trained them and fought beside them and studied their strange ways. But he had never heard one of them explain their nature so clearly. "You have given us much to think about, young human," he said. "This examination was meant to test your ability to forge a weapon. Instead, you have tested our understanding of what a weapon truly is." Bowed her head slightly. A gesture of respect she had learned was appropriate when speaking to Meridian elders. "I meant no disrespect to the Academy or its traditions," she said. "I only wanted to show that there are many ways to solve a problem, and the most obvious way is not always the best." Instructor made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Disrespect? Child, you have given this academy its most valuable lesson in decades. The universe is full of unexpected challenges. A warrior who can only fight in ideal conditions is no warrior at all." He looked around at the assembled students, his 4 yellow eyes sweeping across their young faces. "Remember this day," he said. "Remember what you have learned. And the next time you face a challenge, ask yourself, what would the human do?" He turned and walked out of the forge chamber, leaving behind a room full of students who would never look at weapons or humans the same way again. The examination results were posted the following morning on the main hall's announcement screen. Students crowded around it, pushing and shoving to see their scores. Stood at the back of the crowd, in no hurry to learn what she already suspected. She had placed 7th out of 32 students. Her technical scores for craftsmanship were not high. Her blade was functional but not beautiful. It lacked the precision and polish of her classmates' metal weapons. The judges had given her fair marks for what she had actually built. But there was a note attached to her score, something that had never happened before in the history of the Crucible examination. Special recognition for strategic thinking and innovative problem-solving. By order of the Academy Council, this student's demonstration will be added to the permanent curriculum as an example of adaptive weapon design. Read the note twice, making sure she understood it correctly. Her bone blade, her primitive weapon made from garbage, was going to be taught to future generations of students. "Congratulations," said a voice behind her. She turned to find standing there, his 4 arms folded in a gesture she had learned was meridian for respect. His crystallized titanium blade hung at his side, gleaming in the morning light. "Thank you," said cautiously, had never spoken to her directly before. "My uncle spoke highly of you last night," continued. "He said you reminded him of a human soldier he fought beside during the wars. That soldier saved his life 3 times using techniques that no Meridian would have thought of." "Humans are good at improvising," said. "That is an understatement." Unfolded his arms and held out one of his 4 hands. "I would like to learn from you if you are willing to teach. My uncle says I have become too comfortable, too confident in traditional methods. He says I need to think like a human if I want to truly excel." Looked at the offered hand. In 7 years at the academy, no student had ever asked to learn from her. She had always been the outsider, the curiosity, the primitive who everyone tolerated but no one respected. She took his hand and shook it in the human fashion. "I will teach you what I know," she said, "but you must be prepared to question everything you have learned. Human thinking does not accept sacred rules or untouchable traditions. Everything can be challenged. Everything can be improved. Nodded seriously, I understand. Over the following days, more students approached her. Came first, asking about the techniques had used to prepare for the examination. She was fascinated by the concept of studying potential failures before they happened, of building redundancy into every plan. Then came others, some who had mocked her, some who had ignored her, all of them humbled by what they had witnessed in the forge chamber. They wanted to understand how a human mind worked, how it could see dangers and opportunities that their own minds missed. Taught them as best she could. She explained Earth's history, the constant struggle for survival that had shaped her species. She described the wars and famines and natural disasters that humans had endured, and the lessons those experiences had burned into their collective consciousness. We learned to never rely on a single solution, she told them. We learned to always have a backup plan and a backup for the backup. We learned that the universe does not care about our expectations, so we must be ready for anything. She showed them how to analyze problems from multiple angles, how to identify weaknesses in their own assumptions, how to prepare for scenarios they hoped would never happen. It was hard for them. Their species had evolved on gentler worlds, worlds where cooperation and stability were the keys to survival. They had not been forged in the fire of endless competition and constant danger, but they tried, and slowly some of them began to understand. Even eventually came to her. It was a full week after the examination, and was sitting alone in the academy gardens, looking out at the stars through the transparent dome overhead. She often came here when she needed to think, to remember that she was one small person in a vast universe. Approached quietly, his luminescent skin dimmed with what she now recognized as embarrassment. He stood near her for a long moment without speaking. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "I treated you poorly from the day you arrived. I assumed you were inferior because of where you came from. I was wrong." Looked at him but said nothing. "On, we value grace and beauty and tradition," continued. "We believe that the old ways are the best ways, that our ancestors knew everything worth knowing. I have never had to question that belief before. And now I understand that our ways are not the only ways. Our ancestors survived on a world that was kind to them. Your ancestors survived on a world that tried to kill them every day. Of course you think differently. Of course you see things we miss." He reached into his robes and pulled out something that made S's eyes widen. It was her bone blade, the one she had forged during the examination. She had left it in her room that morning. "How did you get that?" she asked. "I asked permission from instructor," said. "I wanted to study it, to understand how such a simple weapon could do what it did." He held the blade carefully, turning it in the light. "I spent 3 days examining it. I tested its flexibility, its edge retention, its resistance to various conditions. And do you know what I found?" Shook her head. "I found that it is not just a blade, it is a philosophy. Every part of it was designed to solve a problem. The curve for cutting, the sinew for shock absorption, the resin for protection, the meridian scales for aesthetics and identification. Nothing is wasted, nothing is decorative, everything has a purpose." He handed the blade back to her. "I want you to teach me how to think like that. How to build things that work, not things that look impressive. How to survive when everything goes wrong." Took the blade and looked its face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. It was not a complete transformation, she knew. His pride would return, his confidence would rebuild. But something had cracked inside him, and through that crack, a new kind of thinking might take root. "I will teach you," she said. "But remember, human thinking is not comfortable. It means accepting that you might be wrong. It means preparing for failure. It means looking at the universe as a hostile place that owes you nothing." "I understand," said. "No," said gently. You don't, not yet, but you will. She stood up and looked out at the stars again. Somewhere out there was Earth, the small blue planet that had created her, that had forged her ancestors in the fire of endless struggle. She missed it sometimes, missed the feel of real wind and real rain and real danger. But she was beginning to understand that she carried Earth with her wherever she went. It was in her bones, literally and figuratively. It was in the way she thought, the way she planned, the way she refused to accept defeat. She was and she had shown an entire academy of civilized species what that really meant. Come, she said we have much work to do. She walked back toward the academy, and behind her came the prince who had once called her a primitive savage. He walked with his head bowed slightly, his luminescent skin glowing with the soft light of a student eager to learn. And on his belt hung the bone blade, the weapon she had crafted from refuse and determination, the blade that had changed everything. She did not know what the future would bring. She did not know what challenges awaited her in the years ahead, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came, she would survive, she would adapt, she would find a way. That was what humans did. That was what she would always do. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, she thought she could hear her ancestors laughing with approval.